to the first, no, I didn't do that, but it was uncontrollable. And so we thought, well, we can't, it was a horrifying, it wasn't a real kid, but it was still a horrifying thing. And so we said, we can't show that to our other kids. It's too scary. And then so we didn't. And then of course, a couple weeks ago, our 4-year-old did what? Pulled the dresser down on us, all right? Yeah, so, but he was okay. So we have an irrational fear of maybe things like that. I think the biggest one for the most of us, or most people in this room, is probably spiders. Any spider people who are irrationally, oh my goodness, that's a lot of people, irrationally afraid of spiders. If I would have noticed that many people, we would have rigged it. So when I said spiders, fake spiders would have came from the So, hey, let's do that tonight for the Kurt, are you back there? Evening service, we're doing that in Birdsboro. Just a little, whoop, and we're gonna come down. So that'll be awesome. We had a time a little while back where husbands, is there ever times where you're driving your car and like the car is like a multi-ton weapon, right? Like it's dangerous. And so you can't be randomly distracted, but you're driving down the road and suddenly your wife will give out a bone-curdling scream. Has anybody ever had that? Is that just my wife that does that? I mean, it's incredible. You'll give a bone-curdling scream and then you'll think like she had a heart attack or something, and you'll go, what? And you'll be like, a bug landed on me. Like, what? I almost swerved off the road but there was this one time though where it was justified, where I'm driving down the road and she gives out a bone-curdling scream, and I turn because I think like one of the kids is dying or her arm fell off, and she goes, I go, what? And she goes, there is a bug. And I go, oh my goodness, another bug story. But I turn around and this was the granddaddy of all bugs. It was like, I almost started like, what? And so what do you do to try to get the bug out? You put the window down, right? And so I put down her window because I didn't want to come past me. And so I put her window down, but the bug was so big, it wouldn't fit out the window. It was crazy. It's coming out. And so I stopped the car and I got behind it because he was trying to get out. He was nice. And I started shoving him out the window, and I got out of the car, and I just happened to have a saddle in the trunk. I put the saddle on the bug and rode him the rest of the, no, I'm kidding. Irrational fears. What are we irrationally, that was a little far-fetched, but it was a big bug. What are we irrationally afraid of? You know what Christians, and this is for Christians. If you're not a Christian, you're not irrationally afraid of this. You should be afraid of this. But if you're, and we'll talk about that towards the end, but if you are a Christian, you know what we're irrationally, well, some of us are irrationally afraid of? The end. The end. What was the topic that I got? And they were such different questions. Again, we're just going to wrap our arms around this. What was the number one topic that I got questions on for this You Asked For It series? And by the way, every 4 years, I get a lot of these questions. The end times. It's a mystery to me. I don't know why it's every 4 years. I can't figure that out. But every 4 years, especially, the majority of the questions will come around end times and the signs of the times. And this is the biggest question was, are we living in the end times? That's the question I would get over and over again. And so we're gonna take a look at that today, sort of. What I'm actually going to do today is I want to show you the actual proper way to study that kind of thing, because I think we get off track and we've headed in the wrong track a lot of times. Since Jesus in Matthew 24 told his followers that he was leaving and coming and he would soon come back, and he told them in John 13 and all these other places, or John 14, Christians have been asking the same questions over and over. Here they are. When will Jesus return, and what will be the signs of his coming? And every single generation since then has thought that they were the generation that was going to happen, and every single one. For example, Jesus said there will be wars and rumors of wars. Could you imagine, some of you guys, I think we're in this generation, most of us were not. Could you imagine living during World War II and looking at end time prophecy and going, wars and rumors of wars, the whole world is at war, and here's this guy coming up in Germany who seems like he's the Antichrist. I mean, he's killing people left and right and all kinds of stuff. You would think that would have been the end, and yet that was not. That was not. People have tried to predict the end times forever. How many of you guys were alive in 1988? Anybody alive in 1988? Look at I was too. This is all the old people right here, you know. In 1988, there was a book written. It was a book written called "The 88 Reasons That Jesus is Coming Back in 1988." That didn't happen. then so the same guy wrote the 89 reasons why Jesus is coming back in 89. I mean, and on and on. There was the founder of the cult called the Jehovah's Witnesses, and yes, it is a cult. The founder of the cult of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who was Charles Taze Russell, he said this in 1914. He said that Jesus will come back in 1914. And then he was wrong, and he said, well, Jesus is going to come back in 1915. And then he said, Jesus is going to come back in 1918. You see the pattern of what he was doing here? Well, he died, and then his followers said, Jesus is going to come back in 1925. And he said, oh, Jesus is going to come back in 1932, 1941, 1971, 1994. Wrong, 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 wrong. And so we hear and all kinds of crazy predictions, and we hear this, and so the temptation then is to say, well, we should back away from this. We shouldn't study these kind of things because there's too many crazy things going out there. But here's the problem with that. Did you know that almost 25% of the Bible talks about the second coming of Christ? That's a whole lot of Bible to ignore. Did you know that some people go, and I don't know if I go this high, but some people go as high as 50% of the scriptures is prophetic? And so we look at that and go, oh man, can we just ignore that much scripture? And the answer is no. You just have to know how the scriptures are asking us to handle it in the proper way. And that's what we're going to talk about. That's what we're going to talk about today. And the way that we're not supposed to handle it is we're not supposed to be date setters. I mean, Jesus himself said in Matthew 24, he says, nobody knows the time or the hour, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And so we're not going to go to that extreme. You're not going to hear me say, well, because of this, this, and this, what's going to happen is on January of, we're not going to do that. But what we do want to understand today is the proper. There's a lot of reasons why we study prophecy, but I think one of the main reasons that we miss is, let me show it to you. What's the first one I had there? Is it 1 Peter? Or whatever the next verse is. Yeah, it's 1 Peter 4:7. Peter writes this. He says, the end of all things is near. Okay, so what? Therefore, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. So he says, the end is coming, so get your charts out and set your dates. It's not what he says. He says the end is coming, and so therefore, let's talk about how to live right now. Look what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. This is the passage where he talks about, we're going to study this later in the series. This is the passage where he's laying out all these things about the return of Christ, and then he gets to the end and he says, therefore, because Jesus is coming back, encourage one another with these words. And I could show you scripture after scripture after scripture after scripture that is connected with the second coming of Christ or the end times or the Antichrist or all these other things that are constantly saying, here's what's going to happen. And God has been proven true every single time. So we know that what's in his word is still future for us, is going to happen. But we study that. One of the main reasons we study that is so that we can know, how do we live right now? How do we live right now? I had a lot of questions about the signs of the times, okay? And I couldn't answer them all. I had to kind of eat them all into one question. And here's what I want to do today. I want to talk to you about the sign of the times, the one that every single other one wraps itself around, the one that without this one, throw everything else out. It doesn't really matter. This one has to be the key, that one. But I'm not going to do it to scare you. I'm not going to do it, hopefully it's the opposite. I'm not going to do it to say, and therefore, Jesus coming back in 5 days or anything like that. I want to do it with its proper context, which is, because of this, how shall we now live? Okay? So, here's the sign. The one that everything else wraps around, the one that is just insanely miraculous, that there's no other way besides God. Ezekiel chapter 37. Let's take a look at this. Ezekiel chapter 37, starting in verse 1. It says, the hand of the Lord, this is Ezekiel speaking. It says, the hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. And so full of bones, he's not talking about a couple bones here and there. It's the imagery of this monster valley, and just as far as the eye can see, just bones and skeletons everywhere. Verse 2, he led me back. God led me back and forth. The Spirit led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. That's key, very dry. He asked me, son of man, can these bones live? Ezekiel, can these bones live? Can these bones live? You know what Ezekiel's going to do? He's going to give the church answer, right? He's going to say, sure, God, if you do it, if you do something, so that's our answer. Like, can these bones live? Jesus, he doesn't say Jesus, but yes, God, you can do. He gives the church answer to this. All these bones, I want you to just think, don't think of a couple bones. I want you to picture this monster valley. I want you to just think just covered in bones. I mean, it would be really creepy bones. It would be really creepy. And just bones, and the Spirit's taking him and he's seeing all these different bones everywhere. Ezekiel, can these bones live again? Can these dead people live again? Can these dry bones rise again? And Ezekiel says, God, you can do it. So verse 11, it says, then he said to me, son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. And they say, our bones are dried up. That's number one. Our bones are just really, really dry. And our hope is gone. That's the second one. We have no hope. And we are cut off. Therefore, prophesy. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people are going to open up their graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. And then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land, and they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken. I have done it, declares the Lord. And so we've seen three things. These bones are speaking. They're saying we're really dry, we're really cut off, and we're scattered and separated everywhere. And the bones are identified as the nation of Israel. And so when Ezekiel is prophesying, it's about 500-ish BC. It's during it's a little bit earlier than that, but it's 500-ish BC, and it's during the time of Daniel. It's a little bit after the time of Jeremiah, and what has happened was the Babylonians have come in, and they've taken the nation of Israel, and they've destroyed the temple, and they've exiled the people to Babylon. They're out of the land. Israel really, at that point, is not a nation. And yet, at the end of the 70 years of exile, God allows the people to come back, and they reestablish themselves as a nation the first time, and they're there. Really, they're there during the time of Jesus. And when Jesus comes, the nation of Israel is there. Even though they're under Roman rule, the nation of Israel is there, but they reject their Messiah. They reject Jesus. And so God allows the Roman general Titus in 70 AD to come in and completely wipe out the nation of Israel, just destroy it. The temple's gone. I mean, to this day, it's still not rebuilt. It just wiped out. And the people of Israel were scattered among the nations for almost 2,000 years. Gone. And yet we know the end of that story because we're living on the other side of it, right? Almost 2,000 years later, in one day, there's Israel again. How in the world can a nation that has not existed for almost 2,000 years pop into existence in one day? Only by God. Here's what Isaiah says. Isaiah says, before she goes into labor, remember that, she gives birth. Before the pains come upon her, she delivers a son. Who has ever heard of such things? Who has ever seen it like this? Can a country be born in a day or a nation be brought forth in a moment? That's ridiculous. How could that happen? And yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. If you said, what's the number one biggest gotta have it sign? It's this one. That the nation of Israel would exist in the land. Isaiah says in Isaiah 11, in that day the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the Mediterranean. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four corners of the earth. If you were alive in 1948, in May of 1948, you would have read a headline that seemed completely ridiculous. And it would have said, Israel is a nation again. Crazy talk. How can a nation that has not existed for 2,000 years, in one day they're back. In one day they're back. And so you have the imagery that Isaiah talks about of God bringing them back a second time, but you also have the imagery that Isaiah talks about of the labor pains. And every woman who has had a child knows that once you have your first contraction, the baby pops out and that's all, right? Isn't that it? I'm pretty sure that's all it was. No. No. That's not what happens, is it? Every woman knows that once you have your first contraction, let's say the second one comes 10 minutes later, then you know the third one's going to come an hour later, right? No. Everybody knows. Every woman knows that once you have your first contraction, from then on out, the contractions get easier and less painful, right? Am I off base here? Yeah. Barry, okay. It's the opposite of that. It really, really hurts. What happens when your contractions start is they get closer and closer together, and they get more and more painful, and then all of a sudden, whoosh, there's the baby. There's the baby. The nation of Israel, becoming a nation again, was the first contraction. It was the sign that the birth pains have actually really started. And ever since then, the last 72 years, the contractions have continued, and they're getting closer and closer together, and they're more and more painful. Now, oh man, that's going to be creepy. Sorry, but keep me with the illustration. How many centimeters are we dilated? Sorry, I don't know. I don't know that answer. Some people, I don't know. Are we 5 centimeters dilated? Are we 9 centimeters? I have no idea. That's not the point. The point is we are in the middle of the contractions. And we don't know how long those contractions are going to last. But without that first sign, you cannot move forward. Because as you study Daniel and you study the book of Revelation, you study all this prophecy about the end times, you can't have the Antichrist sign a peace treaty with Israel if there is no Israel. You can't have the Antichrist desecrate the Jewish temple if there is no Israel. You can't have Armageddon if there is no Israel. Israel is the first contraction. But since then, the contractions have been coming, and they're closer and closer and closer together. And so that means that the end will come on March. No, I'm just kidding you. That's not going to. That means, what does that mean for us? It means we need to answer the question, how shall we now live? We are in the contractions. We don't know how long they're going to last. But if you're in the contractions, if you know you're at least at some point in the end, then we better figure out how to live because of it. That's what the scriptures constantly tell us. Now, if you're not a Christian, and you know the contractions are coming closer and closer together, and any moment Jesus may come back for us, it probably is a good idea for you to get that part figured out. We'll talk about that later. But let me talk to the Christians first. Most of us in here are believers, and we got to figure out if we're in the middle of it, if we're in the end of it, I don't know, but we got to figure out it's coming. And so we got to figure out how shall we now live. And for our purposes, let's do it based on what God asked Ezekiel, which is, Ezekiel, can these bones live again? We're talking spiritually about your bones and my bones. Can these bones live again? How do you know if your bones are getting dry? How about when there's no desire for prayer and for Bible study anymore? How about when spiritual conversations are avoided and we're embarrassed by them? How about when we begin to rationalize our sin as, it's not that big of a deal? How about when we get ourselves disconnected from our church family and then we search for reasons why everyone else is to blame for that, why that happened? How about when worship of God is about what's easiest instead of actually it's about being worshiping of God? If we're honest, most of us at any given point may have been or currently are dry. There are many people, I'm sure, in this room who you feel like right now your bones are dry. And we feel a lot of times like King David, where King David, if you read the Psalms, you almost think he's schizophrenic because he's all over the place. And we kind of like that because that's how we feel sometimes. David will say this in Psalm 147. He'll say, 138, I'm sorry. He'll say, I will praise you, Lord, with all my heart. Then he'll say in 145, I will praise you every day. Yes, I'll praise you forever. And so it's, God, every day I'm going to wake up with a praise of heart. And I just love you, Lord. You're great. And then you flip the page and he's like, God, why do you hate me? God, where are you? You're nowhere to be found. Everyone's beating up on me and you're not sticking. And then the next page, oh, Jesus. I don't know why I find a way to sing everybody. And he's just all about it. He's all about it. And then the next page you flip again and he's like, oh, soul, why are you so downcast, right? And we like, you know what? I like that. That's real. That's how a lot of times we feel that we're and then our bones are dry, and then we want to go back and say, okay, yes, that's real, but is there a way, as we get closer and closer to the end, is there a way for these dry bones to stay not so dry anymore? And so we look at a person like Paul, and Paul's a guy who wrote about half the New Testament. Paul's a guy who planted more churches than any of us have even almost been in. Paul, humanly speaking, if it wasn't for Paul, we wouldn't be sitting here today, at least humanly speaking. And so you think, well, Paul, he's the man. He's got it all together. Yes. And then you look at Philippians 3:10, and Paul writes, I want to know Christ. You go, stop. You're Paul. How are you going to say, I want to know Christ? You're Paul. You wrote half the Bible, or half the New Testament. How are you going to say you want to know Christ? I want to know Christ, yes. To know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. And in that verse, Paul gives us three key things that we can see in his life and can be true of us about how do we make sure in these last days, as the contractions get closer and closer and closer in these last days, how do we make sure that our bones are not dry, but that we are alive and active and running forward? Here's the first one, number one. He says, never stop the pursuit of intimately knowing, that word knowing God. Verse 10, I want to know Christ. That word know. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. That word know there is the same word that's used in the book of Genesis where it says, Eve knew Adam and they had a son. It's the same word. It's the same word used in the Gospels where it says Mary knew not a man, but she became pregnant. Now, it's not a sexual term in Philippians chapter 3, but it is an intimacy term. It's a term of intimacy there where I want to know, not just know facts about, but I want to intimately, passionately, personally know Christ, is what Paul says. And it's good that Paul said that because we know that he's not talking about a salvation experience, although that's the first step to that. He's talking, at that point in Philippians, he's talking as someone who's been a believer for a good amount of time, and yet he still is saying, I want to know Christ. I want to know Christ. There should never be a time, there can never be a time where we can rest on our laurels. There can never be a time where we go, I got this Christian thing. I know Jesus. I'm set. Because even the Apostle Paul, later on in his ministry, was still saying, I want, present tense, I want to know Christ. Our struggle, one of our struggles, I think is what we do is we compare our growth, our steps, our whatever you want to say, we instead of comparing it to the holiness of God, we begin to compare it to the people around us. And we think, well, I'm better than that person. I'm doing better than that person. I'm not as dry as that person. And therefore, I must be good. In fact, turn to the person next to you who you're better than and just say, bless your heart. Just bless your heart. It's interesting, those of you guys who have people on both sides, how did you choose which one you turn to? Yeah. What Paul's talking about is this intimate, personal, experiential, interactive relationship with Jesus, the God of the universe. And that would have shocked people in his day, and it even shocks people in our day because some of us see God as this impersonal being who's only involved in our lives when there's a hardship, and yet God is your dad. God, as we talked about last week, wants to talk to you. He wants you to talk to him. He wants to have this incredible, passionate love relationship. I heard one dad describe it this way. He said one day he was downstairs doing his devotions, and he gets up earlier, he said, than the rest of his family, and he's trying to get into prayer with the Lord, and just, he's getting a little distracted, and then he heard his kids wake up. And when you're downstairs and your kids first wake up and the sounds that they make, and when your kids are just getting up and they're little, they're kind of, they're snuggly and all that kind of stuff. And he said this, he said this to God. He said, God, why would I rather be upstairs with my kids right now than down here with you? Why would I rather be upstairs with my kids right now, God, than down here with you? And he heard God say this. God said, it's because you don't relate to me the way that you relate to them. And we don't. We have this personal, experiential relationship with our kids, and then we treat God like he's some cosmic, unapproachable being in the sky, even though we know that Paul says in Ephesians, in Jesus and through faith in Jesus, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. And so we got to ask ourselves, do we have that intimate, I want to know every single day, I want to grow deeper with Jesus, that intimate relationship with him? And for many of us, that's not the case. That's not the case. And we might even ask, okay, well, what are Sunday mornings about? If you've been to the growth track, you know what Sunday mornings about. It's not about building a million friends. I hope you do build a million friends. But Sunday mornings, Sundays are about growing deeper and connecting and worshiping the creator of the universe, the savior of our souls. And so we might want to ask ourselves, when it comes to the church service, why are you here right now? Are you here because we serve free Twin Valley coffee? Maybe. Are you here because we have childcare and it gives you a break from your kids for an hour and a half? That's why I'm here. Are you here just because it's your habit to do that on Sundays? Because churches all over the country fill their rooms with promises of money or health, and so people will go, I'll go to church if God will heal me. I'll go to church if they play the song I like. I'll go to church if the message doesn't offend me. By the way, if you're I'll go to church if the message doesn't offend me, don't come next week. I'll go to church if the message is not too long. I'll take Jesus if I get to keep all the things I have, keep all my sins, keep the same lifestyle. But guys, we got to understand that the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, has never been about I'll take Jesus if. It's always been about I'll take Jesus even if. Even if. You want to revive your dry bones? Never, like Paul, never stop the pursuit of intimately knowing Jesus more. Not just here, but here. Number two, Paul says, if you're going to be a follower of Christ, follow Christ. If you're going to call yourself a follower of Christ, follow Christ. There are two especially frightening days for parents when it comes to the car. I've experienced one. I'm about to soon will experience the second one. The first one is when you are trying to take your newborn home from the hospital, right? And when it's your first child, you don't know how to put the car seat in yet. You are scared to death that you're going to snap their neck. You're putting their little cart, the little straps on as tight as you can, but as loose as you can. You're tightening it. Oh my goodness, are they breathing? And you lose, and you're packing their head with towels so it doesn't go all over the place. But then while you're driving, you're scared that they're going to suffocate. And you can always tell a new parent coming home from the hospital because they're driving so slow that funeral processions are passing them, right? That's how it is. Especially a first-time parent, because when you get to like kid 3, 4, and 5, you're like, whatever. So that's a scary day. But you know what day is scarier? And I haven't gotten there yet, but a lot of you guys have. It's the day 16 years later when you hand the car keys over to that same child that you strapped in 16 years before. And now all of a sudden, you are not in control anymore. You used to be the one who chose the destination, you chose the route, you chose the speed. The person behind the wheel is the one that's in control, but now that's not you anymore. And so now they're the ones that are in control. And now they're the ones that are driving so close to the edge of the road that your mirror gets knocked off by a mailbox. And now they're the ones that are merging onto the highway for the first time, but looking like this. And when they turn their hand too, and they just kind of go into the highway. And now they're the ones who think they're in reverse, but they're actually in forward, and they just kind of hit it and they go. I mean, they're the ones that are in control, and it can be scary. I'm told. I'll find out. And yet as scary as letting your 16-year-old sit in the driver's seat of the car, there's a lot of Christians who are more afraid of letting Jesus sit in the driver's seat of their life. We're more afraid of letting Jesus take the wheel, take control, take the keys, than of actually jumping in the car with a 16-year-old driver. Because if Jesus drives, then it goes from me giving when I feel generous to, it's all Jesus' money anyway. And if I let go of the steering wheel and let Jesus in there, it goes, no longer is it about my ego, but now it's about well, what about everybody else? And if Jesus jumps in the driver's seat, now no longer am I in charge of my mouth. Now I don't get to just gossip or lie or curse or manipulate people anymore. When I get out of the driver's seat, I hand the keys over to Jesus. I'm still fully engaged. In fact, I'm more alive than I ever have been, but I'm not the hand on the wheel. There are too many Christians, or there are too many people who prayed a prayer who for some reason think that you can be a follower of Jesus without actually following Jesus. Let me show you what Paul says at the end of verse 10 in Philippians. We like the first part of the verse. I want to know Christ, yeah! Look at the second part of the verse. Go back, Renee, please, to Philippians 3:10.